Saturday, May the 13th, 1989, Sidra Emo. On page 517 in the Chumashim, Leviticus chapter 22, verse 17. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelite people, and say to them, when any man of the house of Israel, of those strangers in Israel, presents a burnt offering as his offering for any of the votive or any of the freewill offerings that they offer to the Lord, it must, to be acceptable in your favor, be a male without blemish from cattle or sheep or goats. You shall not offer any that has a defect, for it will not be accepted in your favor. And when a man offers from the herd or the flock a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord for an explicit vow or as a freewill offering, it must be, to be acceptable, be without blemish. There must be no defect in it. Anything blind or injured or maimed or with a wen, boil, scar, or scurvy, such you shall not offer to the Lord. You shall not put any of them on the altar as offerings by fire to the Lord. You may, however, present as a freewill offering ox or a sheep with a limb extended or contracted, but it will not be accepted for a vow. You shall not offer to the Lord anything with its testes bruised or crushed or torn or cut. You shall have no such practices in your land, nor shall you accept such animals from a foreigner for offering as food for your God, for they are mutilated. They have a defect. They shall not be accepted in your favor. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall stay 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable as an offering by fire to the Lord. However, no animal from the herd or from the flock shall be slaughtered on the same day with its young. When you sacrifice a thanksgiving offering to the Lord, sacrifice it so that it may be acceptable in your favor. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall not leave any of it until morning. I am the Lord. You shall faithfully observe my commandments. I am the Lord. You shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified in the midst of the Israelite people. I, the Lord, who sanctify you. I, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions. On 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred occasion. You shall do no work. It shall be a Sabbath of the Lord throughout your settlements. These are the set times of the Lord, the sacred occasions, which you shall celebrate each at its appointed time. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And on the 15th day of that month, the Lord's feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days. The first day shall be for you a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. 7 days you shall make offerings by fire to the Lord. The 7th day shall be a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land which I am giving you, and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord for acceptance in your behalf. The priest shall wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day that you wave the sheaf, you shall offer as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb of the first year, without blemish. The meal offering with it shall be 2/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in, an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord, and the libation with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. Until that very day, until you have brought the offering of your God, you shall eat no bread, or parched grain, or fresh ears. It is a law for all time throughout the ages in all your settlements. And from the day on which you bring the sheaf of wave offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. You shall bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as a wave offering. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, baked after leavening, as first fruits to the Lord. With the bread you shall present as burnt offerings to the Lord 7 yearling lambs without blemish, 1 bull of the herd, and 2 rams with their meal offerings and libations, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. You shall also offer 1 he-goat as a sin offering, and 2 yearling lambs as a sacrifice of well-being. The priest shall wave these, the 2 lambs, together with the bread of first fruits as a wave offering before the Lord. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. On that same day you shall hold a celebration. It shall be a sacred occasion for you. You shall not work at your occupations. This is a law for all time in all your settlements throughout the ages. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God. And the second reading in the Chumashim on page 528. 528. Page 528 in the Chumashim, Ezekiel 44, verse 15. But the Levitical priests descended from Tzadok, who maintained the service of my sanctuary when the people of Israel went astray from me. They shall approach me to minister to me. They shall stand before me to offer me fat and blood, declares the Lord God. They alone may enter my sanctuary. They alone shall approach my table to minister to me, and they shall keep my charge. And when they enter the gates of the inner court, they shall wear linen vestments. They shall have nothing woolen upon them when they minister inside the gates of the inner court. They shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen breeches on their loins. They shall not gird themselves with anything that causes sweat. When they go out to the outer court where the people are, they shall remove the vestments in which they minister, and shall deposit them in the sacred chambers. They shall put on other garments, lest they make the people consecrated by contact with their vestments. They shall neither shave their heads, nor let their hair go untrimmed. They shall keep their hair trimmed. No priest shall drink wine when he enters into the inner court. They shall not marry widows or divorced women. They may marry only virgins of the stock of the house of Israel, or widows who are widows of priests. They shall declare to my people what is sacred and what is profane, and inform them what is clean and what is unclean. In lawsuits too, it is they who shall act as judges. They shall decide them in accordance with my rules. They shall preserve my teaching and my laws regarding all my fixed occasions, and they shall maintain the sanctity of my Sabbaths. The priest shall not defile himself by entering a house where there is a dead person. He shall defile himself only for father or mother, son or daughter, brother or unmarried sister. After he has become clean, 7 days shall be counted off for him. And on the day that he re-enters the inner court of the sanctuary to minister in the sanctuary, he shall present his sin offering, declares the Lord God. This shall be their portion, for I am their portion, and no holding shall be given them in Israel, for I am their holding. The meal offerings, sin offerings, and guilt offerings shall be consumed by them. Everything proscribed in Israel shall be theirs. All the choice first fruits of every kind, and all the gifts of every kind, of all your contributions, shall go to the priests. You shall further give the first of the yield of your baking to the priest, that a blessing may rest upon your home. Priests shall not eat anything, whether bird or animal, that died or was torn by beasts. Recha.
Why is the Lord so strict about the offering? Who is offering? What should be offered? And it makes a distinction between the burnt offering and the peace offering, and repeats it over and over. Probably the Jews couldn't understand it the first time.
Recha wants to know why God seems to be so particular about what he gets given. Why all these distinctions between the pure and the impure, the people and the priests, the different levels of offerings, the free will offerings, the burnt offerings, the votive offerings, and the gift offerings. What alternative would you prefer, Recha? If you had a chance to write the Torah, what would you put there? I'm giving you your opportunity. It's a lifetime opportunity. How would you organize it? You know, sometimes when one reads a text like this, one says, did they really need to have priests? I mean, couldn't we manage without priests? Wouldn't that be easier? Couldn't we manage without God? That would be much better. I mean, then there'd be no conscience. Everybody would do what they wanted. What? You like that idea, Recha? Children of Israel. Recha is reminding us that we're talking about the children of Israel. That is to say, their mentality seems to be that of children, and therefore the Torah text seems to speak to them with so much repetition and so much precision and with so much distinction and differentiation that it would appear that the author or authors of this text or these texts is really obsessed with the notion that something is radically wrong with the children of Israel. It's time they became the adults of Israel, or at least the adolescents of Israel. And in that lies some of the obsession and the repetition. It's almost as if they're just not getting through. They aren't hearing, they aren't listening. They have eyes, but they see not. They have ears, but they hear not. Jeff?
Well, something which Howard said last week about the
You mean Howard Stevens?
the differentiation between Canaanites and what they were doing and what our new Lord told us to do. But I thought I wanted to add one point to that, which is repeated here, is that after every single prescription and proscription, he's saying, God is saying, I am the Lord. He's reminding you over and over again, you're not doing this for Baal. You're not doing this for a goddess of fertility. You're not doing this for the god of the lintel. You're not doing this for the god of the fireplace. You're not doing this for the hundreds of different gods that existed before. You're doing this for the one and the one God. And it's a leitmotif that's hitting them again and again and again. So, in terms of, sure, they have the repetition of the different offerings repeated again and again, but this idea of the one God, the monotheistic God, that everything is being done for him or for it and it alone.
Yes, you drew my attention after the end of the discussion last week, Jeff, to what was very evident in last week's reading, that almost every injunction was followed by, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord. I mean, what is he talking about? Somebody has to remind you, all as the way he's talking, who he is. I mean, if you had a conversation with somebody, every 30 seconds he kept on saying, I'm Alan Miller, and I'm Alan Miller, and I'm Alan Miller, and I'm Alan Miller. It was a broken record. This God sounds like a broken record. We have to make some sense. Why does he keep on saying, I'm the Lord? Hey, in case you forget me, Yad, hey, Vav, hey, that's me, I, the Lord. Over here, sitting over here, right, the one with the beard, yes, that's me. What is going on here?
Well, they must be children. I know that, we do this all the time.
You're getting your own back on your lane now for last Sunday morning, aren't you?
Well, no, but it's true that when they don't listen, you keep having to, why do I have to do what? Because I'm the mother and I say so. We are the parents. Obviously they must know we're the parents, but if they don't listen, then we have to keep reiterating that we're in charge.
Now, I see that Robert agrees with every word you just said. Is that right? Is that right? Then Recha's observation that this is the children of Israel who are being addressed then gives a new meaning to the question that Jeff raises. If these are indeed children, Jeannie, then God is talking to them as if they were children, and literally every minute, every injunction he gives them, he's got to say, And you do it not because you agree with the insight that I'm giving you, not because intellectually you arrived at the conclusion that this is what you ought to be doing. Oh no, you don't put your hands in the cookie jar because I say so and I'm your mother and I'm bigger than you are. So just get that straight. I am your mother. Although in all fairness to Jeff's point, the mother does seem to be a little insecure, otherwise she wouldn't say it all the time. If you have to say I am your mother more than 5 times in one sentence, it would appear to me that you are beginning to lose your control of the situation. Or the child is retarded. Well, let's not go to that advanced conclusion before we go on. Well, if
We talk about having to teach the same thing to a child 40 different ways when the child has severe learning disability. And they do repeat it 40 different ways, 40 to 50 ways.
well, Jeff, I'll have to think about that. I want to call on Leonard right now. We've heard that the Israelites were a stiff-necked people, and we've heard that Isaac was a retarded child, but not that the Jewish people as a whole were retarded. But maybe there's some point, maybe there's some merit from an ethical point of view. If one looks at the Jewish people as a whole in the world today, is there some moral retardation that we aren't all standing up and screaming at what is being done in the name of the Jewish people? Maybe you've got a point there, Jeff. Leonard. You mean this happens in the Shaza household also? This is one household in the congregation. I thought this never happened.
The question is not where, the question is when. And we do that when either we don't have a reason to give the child for asking them to do what we're asking them to do, or there's a reason that we don't want to share with them. Those are the only 2 occasions. Why else would you give the reason? Do this because I'm the parent. Either you have no other good reason, or you have a good reason, but for some legitimate reason, you can't tell the child what that is.
As a matter of fact, Leonard's observation that we have to say when is this done, and there's a distinction between occasions when the parent does not have a reason, but simply thinks that this is the way the child should behave, and secondly, when the parent has a reason but doesn't feel that the child needs to know about the reason. You didn't explore the possibilities that this may be because the child is too young. Who are you over there? Elizabeth, just one moment. And why don't I let you in right now? You look very excited, Elizabeth.
There's another possibility is that the child argues the parent down. They say, why
The child argues the parent down.
argue the parent down? Gives counter-arguments, and then finally the parent has to say, because I'm your parent.
In other words, Elizabeth is adding to what you said, Leonard, that one of the reasons why the parent finally resorts to invoking authority is because
That's the same thing. That's not having a good enough reason to convince them by logical argument, and then you resort to that.
well, I thought what I heard Elizabeth saying was that the mother thinks it's a good argument, the child just isn't listening. And out of desperation, the mother then says, let me just draw a distinction that the Jewish tradition makes between 2 kinds of laws in the Bible, namely chok and mishpat. Chok is regarded as a statute. This is God saying to the Jewish people, there is no reason, you're doing it because I tell you to do it. The para aduma, the laws relating to the red heifer, are chok. Ushmatem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai. In other words, there's a difference between laws which God says to the Jewish people, you're not going to understand the reasons for this, but I'm telling you to do it because I know what you don't know. The other is a law that is acceptable. And Jewish tradition has always drawn a distinction precisely between what Leonard is saying. Leah, you seem to have some experience in this regard.
Well, I'm going to go off on a completely different tangent and say that somebody gave away the store when they wrote this down. I'm going back to verse 20, I believe that is, on page 517. And it says, whatever has a blemish shall not be acceptable lachem, for you. What do you mean for you? I mean, what I'm hearing here is they said the guy is having to say, I'm here Adonai. He's trying to convince people he's God speaking. This isn't God, this is the writer of the book. Give me the best stuff, I'm the priest. But I want to say that God's saying it, but he gives away the story here by saying it's not acceptable to
I have in front of my eyes right now, I'm ashamed to admit, an image of St. Ambrose as depicted by Goya in the Metropolitan Museum, which we visited yesterday, and I thought that the artist captured in a marvelous way the problem that when the priest is writing what he thinks is revelation, that the Goya caught St. Ambrose in this picture just at the moment when one can't really know whether God is speaking or whether he's imagining that God is speaking, and this is what he's getting. One never knows, of course, whether the priest is just saying what's him or whether he is speaking for God. And when we say here speaking for God, we don't mean that he is speaking on behalf of some supernatural being sitting on a cloud. When the priest speaks for God, he is speaking in terms of the highest level of functioning of the Jewish people. And that is what we understand by God. That which is the ideal point, the cutting edge of the spiritual community. And if the priest reaches that point, regardless of whether there is or is not a supernatural God, he has reached a statement which is worthy of having put at the end of it, Ani Adonai, I am the Lord. Now, the problem that you raise, although actually I thought it was going to be verse 21 that you were getting at, was the whole notion of why this God does not want to be presented with anything that has a blemish. He does not want to see somebody who has AIDS. He does not want to see somebody who has psoriasis, like John Updike, for example. Right? He's just written his autobiography. The big secret has come out. John Updike has psoriasis and therefore has to live by himself because nobody wants to look at him, because he is defective. Nobody wants to look at somebody whose face is falling off all the time. Now, he admits this. He has other things to admit also, which I won't mention right now. We've got enough to deal with right now. Fagel?
As I was reading this, I was thinking that it's harder to give away something that's perfect. It's easy to give away something which is a blemish on it.
All right.
There's demanding a real sacrifice.
All right, yes, but this God is giving me a real problem right now, because this God does not want anybody who is blind or injured or maimed, so that anything that has happened to us, if we had an operation, we've lost part of our being, a mastectomy, or something that has been taken from us, suddenly this God doesn't want to have anything to do with us. He only wants to see the number 10s. Come on, fellas. This is the time to speak on this issue. This is a real issue here. What is this God who only wants perfection? Moreover, and this is the real sentence that I thought you were going for, Leah, but I'll give it to you anyway because you're a nice lady. The real crucial problem in this chapter, as far as we are concerned today, is the notion that it has to be a male without blemish, because the clear implication of God wanting a male without blemish implies that a woman, by definition, is blemished because she is a woman, namely because she is castrated, because she doesn't have one. And in fact, if you look later on in the chapter, when it says in verse 24, and it doesn't quite fit in, it says, you shall have no such practices in your land. What is meant by that is that the pagans castrate their animals for whatever agricultural reasons. But you, the Israelites, the Hebrews, may not castrate your animals. Castration is an abomination to me. And since from the standpoint of the unconscious, the woman is castrated, from the standpoint of the little boy or girl of 3 and 4, there is castration in the woman. This God in this chapter is making a very powerful statement about what he regards as acceptable, which we have to try to understand. Fred? But you're not dealing with the issue of perfection. Jacob?
I'm only a city boy, but I thought that an ox was a bull that had been castrated. And I think that the word in Hebrew is shor. Is that what
There are no castrated animals permitted in the state of the biblical, as understood by the Bible.
You know, in your translation, the word is ox.
Jacob, what can I say? The fact of the matter is that what they mean is not an animal that has been castrated, because such an animal is not permissible. Castration is not permissible, nor may one use an animal that has been castrated by another.
I have an observation that's going to get for a conclusion. I noticed that the prophetic reading is extremely Levitical in its style. It's not like a normal Haftarah. It's like a continuation of Torah.
Yes, well, the observation that Jacob is making is what ultimately led those Bible scholars who spoke about the so-called P document to conclude that Ezekiel and Leviticus come from the same stable, namely that there was a priestly school which drew up the rules and regulations. The only problem that we have is that the authors of the book of Ezekiel seem to come to conclusions about various laws which disagree radically from the the book of Leviticus. And as you may remember, in the second post-Christian century, one of the books in the Bible which had a real problem in becoming canonized, that is to say, in being accepted into the canon of the Bible, was the book of Ezekiel, on the grounds that the rules relating to the priests in that book differed considerably from the rules relating to priests as found in the book of Leviticus. But we come back to the original question, which we can't ignore. What kind of a God is it that only wants to see, Joanne?
It's possible that because God is asking for perfection, it's a state that's always being strived for. That in fact all these sacrifices that have been made have been imperfect because you really can't reach perfection, but it's a state that you constantly strive for. And so the Jewish people are always to try and be better people or in some way perfecting their
Yes, well, what you're trying to do, Joanne, is you're trying to be nice to God, which is a decent thing to do and appreciated by all concerned. What you're trying to do is you're trying to read this chapter not as it stands, as a God. I'm thinking of the story which is told about the Buddha, when the Buddha first received his enlightenment. Some of you also may remember this story, that the father of the Buddha wanted his child to be brought up without coming into contact with anything that was imperfect. He wanted his child, I'm talking about the father of the Buddha, wanted the child to be brought up with total perfection. All the servants in the palace had to be perfect. Everything had to be perfect. But one day they left the door of the palace open and the Buddha ran out for a walk, and within a few moments he came across a corpse and somebody who was crippled and somebody who was blind. And at that moment, the Buddha decided that his life had been oriented in the wrong direction, and this led him into the direction of spirituality. Now, what you're trying to do, Joanne, is to try to defend this author. I'm having troubles with the author. The author is saying to me that this God doesn't want to see imperfect creatures around. I find that on its manifest level offensive. You're saying, well, no, God doesn't mean that. God is saying, not that I don't want to see you guys, but I want to see these guys because these guys remind me of the ideal and the perfection which the Jewish people should strive towards, and therefore I'm not rejecting the maimed and the crippled and the broken and the people with all those spots on their nose. I am simply saying that this is what we should aspire towards. Do I misread you, Joanne?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Because I think that even blind, crippled, and all those imperfections have something that they can strive for in order to make them a more capable or a better person.
But Joanne, that's true, but they are being rejected in this reading.
Only if you read it the way you're reading it.
Well, I don't see how you can avoid reading it on this level. It says, God is saying, don't you bring any of those things near my altar. I don't want to see any of them. Marion?
Just want to make the point that it's always been my observation that there are times when people are feeling within themselves, let's say, the most insecure, the most vulnerable, that they need to strive for perfection, which is unattainable, and to repeat over and over again who they are, as if to try to grasp, somehow
Yes, but Marion, when you say that this God is insecure, you're absolutely right. The only thing is we have to draw attention to the fact that this God is what Vico would have described as an imaginative universal. He's not a single being sitting on a cloud somewhere up there. He is a collective representation of the Jewish people as the whole. Namely, insofar as Vico was the first to make the point that there was no such person as Homer. What we call Homer is an imaginative universal, a name which the Greeks gave to their collective creativity, their collective poetic creativity as a nation. And that Homer is a shorthand symbol to describe poetry as an entity, as an aspect of Greek collective experience. By the same token, Yahweh, Jehovah, Yahweh, whatever you want to call him, or even Moses, are almost certainly imaginative universals that do not apply to a particular individual, but describe the entire collective experience of the group. But the Jews are insecure today. Otherwise, they wouldn't be behaving the way they are behaving today. Jewish leaders wouldn't be talking the way they are talking today if they were not collectively insecure. The equivalent today of saying, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, is saying, I got the machine gun, I got the machine gun, I got the atom bomb, I've got the best army. I can blast your head off. I am the Lord. I am bigger than you are. I have a better army than you have. I have more soldiers than you have. I have more tanks, more airplanes, more machine gun bullets than you have. Ani Adonai, I'm the Jewish people. That's the equivalent. This is a very contemporary text. But we really have to understand why. We have to understand the ideas. Marion, there is insecurity here. This is the permanent insecurity of the best in the Jewish people, a people which always finds itself in a minority position, defending, attempting to promote, to cherish, and to advance certain ethical, spiritual insights which not only the world, but the majority of the Jewish people don't want to bother with. Can you understand why some insecurity or anxiety might express itself? Of course. But the issue I'm coming back to is, what do we do with this notion that this God demands this perfect Marita?
Well, I think the contradiction here, I don't know if the men in the room would agree with me, but it seems to me immolation is a lot more threatening than castration. If they're looking, if it's castration anxiety, that everybody's worried about, nevertheless, they're going to burn the animal, reduce it to nothing. And that seems to me a lot more frightening. I wonder what they're looking at.
But they're not going to burn human beings at this stage. They have advanced beyond the stage of burning human beings.
No, but they won't castrate. They may not castrate an animal.
But they will burn one. Well, they don't just drop it into the fire. They kill it first. And, I would just be as happy as you if there were not all these details about offerings, but apparently they felt that certain emotions in the community ran so high and so deep that there were occasions when there was a need to let blood, on a different level of existence than the human level. We all know that originally it was human beings that were sacrificed. Circumcision is a surrogate operation. We're taking a little bit instead of the whole. Abraham, another imaginative universal, what the Akedah story describes is not so much an event which took place on Monday morning at 10:30 at a particular point in past history on the top of a particular mountain between a particular father and a particular son. Abraham represents an entire historical episode, the whole evolution of the human race, focused in the evolution of the Jewish people from offering human sacrifices, particularly child sacrifices, to the level of offering animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices was a kind of a valve. It was an outlet, Marita. It was an attempt to wean people away. Apparently, people could not be weaned away from these emotions overnight, which is not surprising because we know that these emotions are still with us today. And every human being that is born has to be civilized, and some do better than others. Carl and then Jordan.
I think part, I suspect this was an attempted
Yes, well, Carl is again going back to Jeff's point and underlining it, that we are in the context of paganism, mother goddess worship, where castration was actually an act of ritual worship. The so-called galloi, the servants of the mother goddess, offered their genitalia to the goddess on sacred festivals. We have eyewitness descriptions of this bizarre behavior. In other words, not only mutilating animals, but self-mutilation among human beings was regarded as a way of worshiping this god. I'm going, Jordan, and then I want to take Marion's point a stage further. Yes, Jordan.
I think whether we like it or not, the author is being totally honest.
Is being what?
Totally honest.
He's being in what regard, Jordan?
In what regard, the extent to which human life is very much determined on the way something looks, the visual kind. Whether we accept it or not, so much of what we do and the way we behave, what's on human beings, does relate to the way they look. And they look nice to us, but they don't. I mean, in a very simplistic way, kind of thing. And take it to the father, mother, child now. I think a lot of the envy that parents, a mother feels towards a daughter, or a father feels towards a son, is simply because the child now has the looks and the visual beauty that parents have never had. I think the parent has a hard time with just that visual sense. So visually, prettier or handsome,
I have a vision in front of me right now of a painting by somebody called Ghirlandaio, an old man looking at his grandson. The old man falls under the category of the reading that we read this morning. Emily, please help me. He has a pockmarked face, he has psoriasis, he has a carbuncle. What? Bumps all over his nose. He has, actually it's been diagnosed as some kind of a disease. And this is the kind of person that looks absolutely horrendous. And yet the child is looking at this old man with an attitude of love and adoration of such an intense order that as you look at the picture, you slowly begin to see the old man's ugliness and deformity through the eyes of the loving child, and the old man begins to look absolutely beautiful in a way that I can't remember who's the current heartthrob of television screen. Come on, you all know. His name is escaping me for obvious reasons. Come on. Tom Selleck, thank you, Naomi. I was going to say Teddy Kollek, but I knew that was wrong. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The very attractive, narcissistic woman who thinks the whole world exists for her sake is ugly. And the person who is ugly can be beautiful depending on the kind of way they behave. I don't want to buy into this first version of God in our reading today. I have a different understanding of this, and I'd like to proceed to it right now. Wait a bit. Who hasn't spoken? Anybody who hasn't spoken already? Betty.
I'm still stuck on the farm.
You're still stuck on the farm with Jacob. Well, there are worse places. Jacob.
Perfect male animals.
Perfect male animals. Alan, did you have your hand up there? Okay, hold on. Yes. Betty, come, sorry.
A great deal of trouble. Not only do they not reproduce or provide milk or clothes, they battle each other. I can't understand why they would saddle themselves with maintaining, not allowing any castration. One way to get rid of the force of sacrifice regularly, and those are the ones that we eat, was because absolutely.
Well, the answer, Betty Ann, is very simply that castration played an integral role in pagan worship. And they were trying to separate themselves. In other words, if you look at that sentence, you shall have no such practices in your land. And then it goes on, nor shall you accept such animals from a foreigner offering as food for your God, for they are mutilated, they have a defect. In other words, there was, again, this is, you see, it's so funny. Sometimes we're talking about things that happened 3,000 years ago, and yet it's happening right now. The survival of the Jewish people We're a minority. We're always going to be a minority. That's the problem. How does a minority survive? It can't hermetically seal itself off from the majority. It has to be able to assimilate. But it can only assimilate creatively. That is to say, it can only take from the environment that which enhances its own value system. And the problem in every generation is how to know what is creative assimilation and what is destructive assimilation. And unfortunately, for all our sakes, this is only known several hundred years after we've gone from this vale of tears. That is to say, it's only long after the Pharisees had died that it became evident that the only group that knew what they were doing at the time of the destruction of the temple were the Pharisees, and that's why the Jewish people survived. Had any other group been in charge of the Jewish people, the Zealots, for example, the Sicarii, who defended Masada, who have their latter-day descendants in the Knesset, those who defended Masada were totally obliterated. They are only remembered today because of the Jews who studied Talmud for 2,000 years in academies based on the academy originally built at Yavne, which was the offer that Yochanan ben Zakkai got from Titus at the time when Jerusalem was destroyed. I want to go back to this point again because I think it's interesting to place this in a larger context. Among the ancient Babylonians, there was a myth about people who had wens or boil scars or scurvy. People like John Updike, who were born with incurable psoriasis. Or as he says in a recent article, he is faintly amused by the fact that no matter how much he scrubs his hand, one of his fingers always smells abominably. That is to say, there is some myth in ancient Babylonia that the gods one day had a party when they were creating the world. They worked from 9 to 5, and they got tired, so they drank some beer. And they drank more beer. And they got drunk. And as they were drunk, they began to create people who turned out to be the character in the Ghirlandaio painting, the ones with short legs, the one with 8 toes, the one with hunchbacks. All these blind, injured, maimed, boil-scarred, scurvy people were created by the gods, according to the ancient Sumerian Mesopotamian myth, while the gods were inebriated. Now, I am the owner of a cake factory. I make cakes. Nice cakes, sponge cakes, okay? And we sell them all over the country. And we're having the annual party. And the office staff are telling me what a wonderful entrepreneur I am because we've trebled their salary, we've quadrupled the number of cakes that we're selling, and we're now beginning to open up cake outlets for sponge in New Guinea, in Australia and New Zealand, okay? Now, what do you think I feel like as the CEO coming in and seeing that on the table they've got all the sponge cakes that didn't rise? Come on, let's have somebody give a response to that. Instead of choosing the finest sponge cakes, those that have the aura of youth, the blush of youth, fresh from the oven, the sponge cake, people don't seem to get so preoccupied with the sponge cakes. When I remember my childhood, my mother's main preoccupation was the question of I think when I was a child, the fall had nothing to do with Adam and Eve. It had to do with the kitchen and a sponge cake that didn't go up properly. Would somebody answer? Yeah, what is your name? Rachel, this is the first time you've been here? Thank you for participating.
I think it's because the original vision is Mara. You have this idea of what you've created, and your mind is perfection, and you want everybody to share in that. You would also like your communication to the world to be that perfection which you envision, but unfortunately what is being shown is something that's marred.
Rachel, thank you very much. In other words, what you're saying is that the CEO who got exercised because they put a cake that didn't rise on the table, in other words, all the broken cakes with the crumbs all over the place, the ones you have to eat and they fall down your ear, was not making any negative comments, wasn't making any moral statements about the cakes that didn't make it. He was just saying, hey, listen, I'm in business to make sponge cakes that rise. When a sponge cake doesn't rise, that's not what I wanted. I didn't get drunk and allow the sponge cake to fall. I was rational at all times when I was making these sponge cakes. These sponge cakes that disintegrated do not represent me as a sponge cake maker. May I speak in the name of God? And the whole problem of evil is bound up in this image. God is saying to us in this reading, Mariam, God is saying to us in this reading, I didn't mean to make John Updike the way he is. If you really think that I mean to make people whose limbs are twisted from birth or who develop sicknesses which involves people cutting lumps from their bodies, you're telling me I'm God and you're telling me I wanted to create things like this? I didn't. What do you think I am? A Sumerian? A Mesopotamian? A Babylonian? I'm the God. Ani Adonai. I'm Yad-Heh-Vav-Heh. Don't you remember who I am? You are telling me that I wanted to create such defective things? No, I wanted man to be without blemish. I wanted a perfect human race. And therefore, when you offer sacrifices to me, please don't put on the altar. Please don't put on the altar the things that went wrong, because I didn't mean them to go wrong. My aspiration for the human race is that nobody should have to be burdened with these imperfections. And so the question that arises out of the 22nd chapter of Leviticus is the entire problem of evil. Now, this is a very delicate topic to raise within the walls of this synagogue, because Rabbi Kaplan had a very, very distinct view of evil. A view of evil which probably corresponds very closely to the view of Spinoza. And indeed, many people have assumed that Spinoza influenced Kaplan prodigiously, although Kaplan very rarely speaks of Spinoza in his writings. That is, that evil is not something in and of itself, something that's substantive. Evil is not real. According to Kaplan, evil is the absence of good, which was Spinoza's view. That is to say, when we see people who have wens or scabs or boil scars or scurvy or psoriasis or have all these horrible things done to them, or arrive in the world with all these horrible things already having been done to them, this is just something that went wrong. God didn't intend it, and therefore nothing theological or philosophical can be built on it. You can't make a case against God because there is evil in the world. If a sponge cake doesn't rise, it's not because God willed that the sponge cake should not rise. It's that by nature of making sponge cakes, some are going to go wrong. You're going to get some genetic complications if you're going to have human beings. Not because God wants it. And this was Kaplan's view, that evil is not real. I used to question him on this, and he'd say to me, it's like the dark side of the moon. That's before the astronauts landed there. In other words, we can't see it, but if we could see it, we'd see that it's something that, in other words, we're living in a world where we have not yet been able to control the genetic code, but when the saints come marching home, when the brave new world comes into being, it's almost impossible to recite this reconstructionist dogma right now, we'll be able to prevent people being born like this because we'll know how to stop it. I suppose you could say if we can abort everybody that we know has this kind of problem, that is a way of stopping it, but it doesn't really answer our question. The other view of evil is a much more serious view of evil. The other view of evil is that evil is real. And I have to part company with Rabbi Kaplan on this, and I part company with him and feel utterly alienated, utterly confused, spiritually and theologically, because last Sunday I watched the Channel 13 television program about the Wannsee conference when a handful of Nazis got together and decided they were going to wipe out 6 million Jews. And thinking about this text and watching, you didn't see any Jews dying of starvation. No, there was no blood. You didn't even see what you saw in Shoah, the railway trains, and that haunting sound of the railway whistle. All you saw was human beings discussing, Robert's rules, whether those Jews who were half Jews should be thrown into the pit with the others, and the questions of how much pressure might be brought to bear, or whether this was something that Hitler should be asked about, or whether those there had the authority to do it. And at the end, they all drank a toast and said, very good, we've now just... You see, that is not just an absence of good, as far as I can see. To me, these men were evil, and they had to be exterminated. And this is something that horrifies me, that I can even think in this fashion. Because the question, when one says there is evil, and evil, the whole issue of the death penalty that's coming up right now in New York State, the whole issue of the death penalty, what are we all going to do if we finally find that Cuomo cannot overturn the two-thirds majority vote that he needs to reintroduce the death penalty in one of the so-called most civilized states of the world in the history of the human race? What are we going to do? Are we going to just say publicly, it's very wrong, we shouldn't have the death penalty, but secretly go home and applaud because we would like to see the young men who attacked the woman in Central Park a few weeks ago put into the electric chair? It's not just a question of whether evil is substantive. It has to do what goes on inside our heads. Now, if we can look at the reading from chapter 22 of Leviticus as a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, you know, the Afikoman on the Seder night, after many years of being gypped by my kids, I finally decided the only way to prove, because there used to be 3 or 4 different Afikomans coming up at the end of the meal. And the question is, will the real Afikoman please stand up? The only way to do this was to take the original piece from which you broke the Afikoman and see whether the pieces fit. It was like a spy story. I mean, if one piece comes in with a lump sticking out there and you can see it has no relationship with the piece that you broke a couple of hours ago, then you know that this kid is deceiving you and you try to wait for the Afikoman that fits. If one could see, when one tears a piece of paper, that this is only part of a fantasy system in the minds of human beings, that the notion that women are castrated men is erroneous, and no human society and no human institution can be posited on the notion that women are castrated males. Yet to deny the fact that that fantasy operates in the mind of every single male and female that ever walked this earth is denying patent reality. And the purpose of our reading this text in the synagogue, among other things, is to get in touch with the underlying feelings, not to act on them in order to put down people who are lame or maimed or deemed to be castrated, but to make sure, this is the other side of the paper, the piece of the Afikoman that fits, that we can deal intelligently and in a civilized way with these issues. And indeed, in many regards, society is moving towards this. We have the year of the sexually abused child. We have the year of the lame, the year of the cripple. There's a whole new perspective over the last 10, 20 years about museums being built so that crippled people can use their armchairs, their wheelchairs, and get in by themselves. And the whole notion of going on buses, this is just the last 10 or 20 years. We must constantly try to improve society so that we can aspire towards that ideal world where nobody will be precluded from going to the opera just because they are crippled. It will be taken for granted that every time you build a public building, there will be access for the blind and the lame and the poor and the homeless and the fatherless and the widow and the orphan. But that there is much more chance of this ideal utopia, never to be totally reached state of affairs coming about if we acknowledge the fact that one of the reasons why there are so many impediments to this ideal society is that so many people are not in touch with the notion that deep down in their unconscious they believe that women are castrated males. And it is when ideas are not allowed to arise to the surface, when we are not in touch with those subterranean themes, that we tend to act out. We tend to legislate capital punishment. We tend to legislate against certain kinds of people. And that is when evil becomes a substantive reality. I'm wrestling with the problem of evil. I'm working on the problem of evil. I would like at some stage in my life to get back to the blissful naivete of my early youth when I was able to accept Rabbi Kaplan's notion that evil is nothing, it's just the absence of good. But he wrote that before 1939. And all of Reconstructionist theory stands judged. It's optimism, it's sweetness and lightism. All stands judged in the sight of one child who was thrown into a pit of fire. We rise for Aleno on page 194.
Saturday, May the 27th, 1989, Bechukotai.
In the Chumashim on page 542, the book of Leviticus, chapter 26, verse 3. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant your rains in their seasons, so that the earth shall yield its produce and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land. You shall give chase to your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. I will look with favor upon you, and make you fertile, and multiply you, and I will maintain my covenant with you. You shall eat old grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new. I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out from the land of the Egyptians to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. But if you do not obey me, and do not observe all these commandments, if you reject my laws and spurn my rules, so that you do not observe all my commandments, and you break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will wreak misery upon you, consumption and fever, which causes the eyes to pine and the body to languish. You shall sow your seed to no purpose, or your enemies shall eat it. I will set my face against you. You shall be routed by your enemies, and your foes shall dominate you. You shall flee, though none pursues. And if, for all that, you do not obey me, I will go on to discipline you sevenfold for your sins, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper, so that your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land shall not yield its produce, nor shall the trees of the land yield their fruit. And if you remain hostile toward me and refuse to obey me, I will go on smiting you sevenfold for your sins. I will loose wild beasts against you, and they shall bereave you of your children and wipe out your cattle. They shall decimate you, and your roads shall be deserted. And if these things fail to discipline you for me, and you remain hostile to me, I too will remain hostile to you. I in turn will smite you sevenfold for your sins. I will bring a sword against you to wreak vengeance for the covenant. And if you withdraw into your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and you shall be delivered into enemy hands. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in a single oven. They shall dole out your bread by weight, and though you eat, you shall not be satisfied. But if despite this you disobey me and remain hostile to me, I will act against you in wrathful hostility. I, for my part, will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. I will destroy your cult places and cut down your incense stands, and I will heap your carcasses upon your lifeless fetishes. I will spurn you. And the second reading in the Chumashim on page 551 from the book of Jeremiah, page 551 in the Chumashim. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 19. O Lord, my strength and my stronghold, my refuge in the day of trouble. To you nations shall come from the ends of the earth and say, our fathers inherited utter delusions, things that are futile and worthless. Can a man make gods for himself? No gods are they. Assuredly, I will teach them once and for all. I will teach them my power and my might, and they shall learn that my name is Lord. The guilt of Judah is inscribed with a stylus of iron, engraved with an adamant point on the tablet of their hearts and on the horns of their altars, while their children remember their altars and sacred posts by verdant trees upon lofty hills. Because of the sin of your shrines throughout your borders, I will make your rampart a heap in the field, and all your treasures a spoil. You will forfeit by your own act the inheritance I have given you. I will make you a slave to your enemies in a land you have never known, for you have kindled the flame of my wrath, which shall burn for all time. Thus said the Lord, cursed is he who trusts in man, who makes mere flesh his strength, and turns his thoughts from the Lord. He shall be like a bush in the desert, which does not sense the coming of good. It is set in the scorched places of the wilderness, in a barren land without inhabitant. Blessed is he who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord alone. He shall be like a tree planted by waters, sending forth its roots by a stream. It does not sense the coming of heat. Its leaves are ever fresh. It has no care in a year of drought. It does not cease to yield fruit. Most devious is the heart. It is perverse. Who can fathom it? I, the Lord, probe the heart, search the mind, to repay every man according to his ways, with the proper fruit of his deeds. Like a partridge hatching what she did not lay, so is one who amasses wealth by unjust means. In the middle of his life it will leave him, and in the end he will be proved a fool. O throne of glory, exalted from of old, our sacred shrine, O hope of Israel, O Lord, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those in the land who turn from you shall be doomed men, for they have forsaken the Lord, the fount of living waters. Heal me, O Lord, and let me be healed. Save me, and let me be saved, for you are my glory. Michael.
I don't remember what it was like to be a Jew before the state of Israel, because for me it's always been there. But I remember talking to a man as old as me who lived through the Holocaust and said, we stand erect because of the state of Israel. I wonder if the people can stand erect just having this. I'm thinking of lines, just having a book, having a religion, having a God. And I'm thinking of the line that says, I brought you out of Egypt and caused you to stand erect. About line 14, I think. Or 13, verse 13. Would it be enough if there was not a land of Israel? Even black Americans now want to be called African American so that they can relate to some other land, some land. It's asking a lot to say, I am your God, brought you out of
strength and knowledge in them.
Let me repeat what Michael observed. Michael says that he doesn't remember the foundation of the State of Israel because he was too young. It was before his time. But he does remember somebody who was alive before the existence of the State of Israel saying to him that the only reasons, I'm putting it in my words, if you want to correct me, Michael, please do so. The only reason why a Jew can stand erect today is because of the existence of the State of Israel. Without the existence of the State of Israel, no Jew can stand erect. And Michael very shrewdly draws attention to the fact that in verse 13, without a land, but only with a book, as Michael puts it, the Torah reading today suggests that you can stand erect without a land. And I think at the end, Michael suggested that it was too difficult or too hard. Is it possible for Jews to stand erect without having a land, without having power? The tradition clearly indicates that it was possible. The tradition clearly indicates that the promise of God was sufficient to give the Jews that sense of holding their heads up. But that today, the man who spoke to you, and he echoes many other Jews, says, we cannot stand erect without the land. Jacob?
There's a theme that's repeated in several parts of Torah. You read it in the Shema. It comes into the end of Deuteronomy. And there's a wealth of possibilities for interpretation of the tone. But the message is, here's the deal. You obey the law and you prosper, you disobey the law and you suffer. And for me, what stood out was in the Haftarah, the 9th sentence of the 27th chapter.
You mean 17, don't you? The 7th, we don't have the 27th chapter.
The heart is deceitful above all things, and it's exceedingly who can know it. And you know, this really hits home to me. I know all the things about, or enough about the law, about what will make me prosper or help me and what will not. That does not stop me from eating that piece of apple pie. And that's just one example. It's a theme that's repeated and repeated and repeated, but the message is received exceedingly slowly.
Mm-hmm. Neely?
Michael's remark, I thought it was very interesting that just the Hebrew word that ends verse 13 is the word komeniyut. And in Israel, I think the official name for the War of Independence is Milchemet HaKomeniyut. That's exactly it. So it's not,
Well, Neely, what you're suggesting is that the State of Israel has given a strong reading or a different reading or a distorted reading of a word which had completely different meaning, its original source. When the author of the biblical text that we read this morning said, Va'olech etchem komemiyut, he was not speaking in the sense that the State of Israel uses that word. And I'm not suggesting which one you should adopt, but I think it's very important to draw attention to a change of meaning in a word as radical as this. If we want to develop it further, we could say that the State of Israel has taken over major, key, value terms of Jewish existence and given them a very specific ideological twist, which is totally at odds with the classical traditional interpretation. I'm not giving any decision on this. Don't start getting excited. You're big boys and girls, you have to make your own decisions. But what Zionist ideology has done is to totally twist the meaning of Jewish existence. That the word komemiyut, which originally had a spiritual dimension, a dimension that a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi might have understood, has been turned into atom bombs and a highly developed military dimension. So Common Miyut, we stand Common Miyut because we have machine guns. We do not stand Common Miyut because we have faith in a God. The meaning of Common Miyut in chapter 26 of the book of Leviticus has nothing to do with an army. The fact that the Jews, 5 Israelites, can chase 100 of their enemies has nothing to do with their weapons. It's ridiculous. How can 5 chase 100? The answer is that God does the fighting for them. They don't need weapons, because it is a spiritual battle, and God, Adonai yilachem lachem, God will fight the battle for you. That is to say, and Michael's point really really focuses the reading this morning. Va'olech etchem Common Miyut, what the Torah is saying, and again, agree or disagree, you don't need atom bombs to stand erect. To the Jew, whether you like it or you don't like it, you don't need a state to stand erect. The meaning of Judaism is standing erect because you possess a certain value system. And whether you are alive or dead, that value system remains and stands in judgment on any attempt to misread the meaning of Common Miyut. Now this is in the text. Whether we like it or not, we can argue till the cows come home, but that is what the text means. And the fact that the word Common Miyut was taken to mean the War of Independence is very striking, because it is like a central word. It's one of Rabbi Kaplan's constant complaints that, for example, the word salvation, Hoshienu Adonai v'ivashea, which is in the last verse of the Haftarah this morning, Refaeni Adonai v'erafei Hoshieni v'ivashea. That ivashea comes from the word yasha, like Yeshua, as in Jesus. And I think Rabbi Kaplan complained all his life, as long as he was in possession of his mental faculties, against the fact that Jews believe that Christians created the notion of salvation. Every time Rabbi Kaplan stood on this pulpit, he complained bitterly that Jews don't understand that salvation is a Jewish concept, and that the Christians took over the word Yeshua, which meant fulfillment in the terms of obeying God's law on the land, and turned it, which was a this-worldly conception of salvation, and turned it into an otherworldly, supernaturalistic notion of salvation, coming from believing that Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah. So now we know how you create a new religion. You take the most central concepts of your enemies and you give them your own interpretation and hope that it holds. Nelly, I'm sorry, I broke in there.
I don't mean, my other remark has nothing to do with Israel, but after what you said about Zionism, I find it very hard to...
I know. I know.
Wait a minute, no. And you say that you totally separate the land from the concept of community, and yet, reading the text, the first tribe for keeping the Hukotai is Ha'am. Okay, there's no, this is a part of this, unfortunately, the Jewish anomaly, to take it out and say, okay, community stands separate from Amen. But in the text that you read yourself, the whole thing, and what I really wanted to comment on, was how much the imagery and the metaphor is all connected to the land. So even when he talks about a man being happy, he talks about the tree with roots. And I think it's unfortunate that we have to separate it and say, and give it sources of rationalization to the existence of the Jewish people. But as you always say, this is people that is on its way, going from one point to another, and yet, of course, while they're going to their land, they're walking from a view. But one of the reasons they're walking so from a view is because they're going to the land.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nili, you're right, but the land that they were talking about was not the land as we know it today in the guise of the state of Israel. Listen very carefully. I'm going to come off sounding like a Satmara. When we say in the Haggadah, Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim, we are not talking about Teddy Kollek's Jerusalem. And let's be quite clear about that. The notion of the land, as is evidenced by Jewish history. All you have to do is to study Jewish history and observe when the Jews began to take seriously the notion of going back to the land. Until that point in time, They were perfectly happy to live in Germany or in France or in Italy or in Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Poland or Russia, wherever they were given enough freedom to be able to survive. The drive to go back to the land today, to say that that drive was a spiritual drive, is a total distortion. It was a very pragmatic need to have some place for Jews to go who had nowhere else to go. But we're not dealing with politics in the synagogue. We're dealing with theology. And therefore we have to understand that when the Haftarah and the Torah base Komamiyut on the land of Israel, they are talking about a spiritual relationship to the land, which does not comprehend what is going on and what is reported in the newspapers in our day. This is very difficult, very, very difficult to understand this text. But we have to draw a distinction between the messianic idea, the notion of a land which would be a spiritual experience, and a land which was a political reality. If you read the founders of Zionism, let us just go to Mordecai Kaplan in his book, The Greatest Zionism in the Making. It's rather difficult to see because the dirt of New York has almost concealed it completely, but that is the original logo that Rabbi Kaplan created to evince what the philosophy of Reconstructionism was all about. He did not speak of a state of Israel. Rabbi Kaplan, typical of most of the founders of Zionism, I'm thinking of the Achad Ha'am school, not the Herzlian school. What did Herzl know about Judaism? What in God's name did Theodor Herzl know about Judaism? Like many modern Zionists, he was driven back to Zionism because of the Dreyfus case. Without Dreyfus, there would have been no Judenstaat. Achad Ha'am was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. His Zionism came from Komamiyut. He spoke of Merkaz Ruchani, a spiritual center. And one of the greatest influences on Mordecai Kaplan's thinking was Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am, John Dewey, Emil Durkheim. And what did Kaplan get from Achad Ha'am? The notion that the gathering of Jews in the state of Israel, in Palestine, which was needed for a resurrection and a renaissance of the Jewish spirit, need not be a political state with an army. As a matter of fact, Kaplan, in the last decade of his life, told me how he had one day dreamed that the Yishuv, or what he called it, Zion, in Kaplan's vocabulary, Zion was an organic Jewish community living on Palestinian soil, but not possessed of an army. He wanted the Yishuv, he wanted Zion to be part, don't laugh, of the British Empire. He thought that if somehow Zion could become like Canada, it would be absolved from having an army, absolved from facing the kind of problems which are tearing the state of Israel apart today. We have to believe, and I know it's hard for the congregation to believe, but I do believe, but I don't think many members of the congregation believe, but I do believe, that those who wrote the words that we read this morning had gone through this cycle of land, Komamiyut with bombs, Komamiyut without bombs. The whole essence of Judaism is the experience of people watching major empires, not a state of Israel. I'm talking about Rome. I'm talking about Greece. I'm talking about Persia. I'm talking about Babylon. Rise and fall. Rise and fall. Rise and fall. To go into Alexandria, to go into Rome, to go into the ancient capital of Persepolis in their moment of glory was like walking down Wall Street today or walking down the canyons of downtown New York. How on earth is it possible that such an incredible city could ever lie in waste? And yet Isaiah prophesied of Nineveh, thy princes sleep in the dust. These people, unfortunately, you take to be idealists and dreamers. They are more realistic than Ariel Sharon. They have seen what happens when people put their faith in bombs. Ultimately, they destroy themselves. And since we're on this topic, Billy.
I don't think it's an either or. I think that 40 years ago, too many people went into the ovens, feet first, not standing erect, and you know why there's an army and why there's a need for that. One. Two, a very large segment among Orthodoxy
You know, during the past few weeks, I've had the good fortune to listen to two outstanding speakers on the topic of Israel. I was moved, I was touched, I was inspired, I was elevated by Aryeh Eliav here at the SAJ last week, and by Abba Eban at the Jewish Museum on Tuesday night this week. But I was profoundly disturbed by most men. Profoundly disturbed by them. One thread rang through both speakers. It came in very subtly and quietly at the end of their remarks. And this was to the effect that after all this talk about we must talk peace, we must talk peace, we must talk peace, they finally came down to the point that the Israeli army is so strong that it could destroy the whole Arab world. That's what Eliav actually said, that the Jewish army, the Israeli army, could take on every single Arab state and wipe them out. And that is why we can sit and talk with the Arabs, because we have the ultimate power. And if we didn't have that power, if we just wanted to talk about peace without power, the whole thing would be totally meaningless. Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, but when I hear two distinguished representatives of the left wing of Israeli government saying, my stick is bigger than yours, so either you do what I do or else, I hear the words, the primitivism, the utter primitivism of the reading this morning. What kind of a God is talking here? I'll tell you what kind of a God, the God of Abba Eban, the God of Aryeh Eliav. He is saying, my army is the best and the biggest in the world. This is God speaking. I have every single weapon you can imagine. Don't even try to fight me, because I will wipe you out. I can take on not just what the Israeli army can take on, all the Arab nations, I can take on America and Russia and China at the same time. Not to mention Mars, Venus, Saturn, any other place you want to mention. So do me a favor, obey the Torah, and let's all be nice and have peace together. But if you don't, I'll zap you. And I'll zap you, and I'll zap you again. I counted 5 times the raising of the ante. This is peace talk. We have to ask ourselves, reading this segment, we have to react not as if we were reading an ancient document which is outworn, which we should be replacing by the New York Post or perhaps the New York Times. We should ask ourselves, how can we get into that kind of position in which we can understand what they're saying? When any self-respecting author who has any kind of authentic, genuine creativity in him or her writes, they write up to a point, but they want the reader to come and meet them. They're not going to give everything away. They create a certain ambiguity, a certain tension, so that the reader can come. And usually in any given age, the reader knows the references and knows the allusions and knows what is between the lines, as it were, and so the reader can mesh with the writer, and there can be some kind of mutuality of comprehension. But when the writer lived thousands of years ago, a greater effort is required. First of all, one has to believe that it's worthwhile reading this book. Secondly, one has to try to put oneself at a point in the focus of where the ancient author was standing at. That is to say, we have to try psychologically and emotionally to descend to the level of emotion which this author was addressing, and only then, having begun to understand what they were talking about, can we try to translate it into our modern idiom. You don't have to do it, but this is our text. This is our document. Now, what kind of a God is reflected in this reading this morning? Or let me formulate the question differently. Since God, as I understand God, is not a substantive entity floating on a cloud somewhere in the Empyrean, but the term God is a term which describes something which is a function of a collectivity, so that God, from a Jewish perspective, becomes an aspect, a dimension of the experience of the Jewish people, and there are as many different Jewish gods, or there are as many different Jewish applications of the God idea, as there are phases and moments in Jewish evolution and development, collectively speaking, what kind of a people thought this way? And how much does the thinking of that primitive group almost 3,000 years ago reflect our thinking today? That is to say, how far have we advanced ethically from the ancients? Jordan.
What I was thinking when I was reading it was not that it's a reality, anything that was being said, but almost in a strange kind of way, I felt comforted by the Spirit.
You felt
Comforted.
competent? Oh, comforted, I'm sorry.
And I get why was such a, when you read it, feel so comforted. And I guess maybe the comfort comes from the honesty of a God that can have all these thoughts. That God that lives in the real world, that God that ups the end, that can get so angry and so vengeful that he actually could articulate what his vengeful thinking is in his mind. But I don't think it's a God that would act it out. I felt secure that a God that could articulate this and be honest about his feelings would not be a God that would look at what really was connected to the human dimension of what human beings really think, really feel.
You get?
I felt contrary to Jordan because I was very angry at the Torah rather than comforted. Because I know that if I want to change a child's behavior or anybody's behavior modification, I would not choose a threat because that would be the last thing that would make that child change. I would use other means rather than compromise, talking, listening, in order to bring the best out of that child. And obviously, God wanted to bring the best out of these people, and the last thing that he had to do was to threaten them from bad to worse if they didn't do what he said. And that made me very angry.
You get it is the teacher in you. The teacher in you can see what's going on here. But I want to take it a stage further. The reading makes me angry also. Makes me angry on several scores. It's so primitive. I hear not a teacher speaking to a pupil, but a parent speaking to a child. And there's an atmosphere of desperation. That is to say, the parent in this particular area knows better than the child. I think that's reasonable. Let's say about a child crossing the road without looking both ways. The parent knows that for a child to cross the road without looking both ways is suicide. But the child is very courageous and very spunky, and the child keeps on running ahead. And the parent slowly moves into a mode of desperation, beyond the point when you say, you're in control, and you're talking quietly, and you're not getting excited. At some point you move from that stage to the point of anger. And you say, you do it because I'm bigger than you, and if you don't not do it, I'll smack you over the head, or something of that order. In other words, this God is losing his temper. Now, we can see it in many ways. We can see it in the sense that the stakes are high. The stakes are very high here. It's not over a trivial matter that this God is getting angry. This God is getting angry, or shall we say, the collectivity of the Jewish people, articulated through its spiritual leaders representing its God, is getting angry because it sees a people squandering its resources. It sees the Jewish people self-destructing. It sees the Jewish people not learning anything from mistakes. It sees the Jewish people refusing to listen to people who do know something about Jewish history and Jewish religion, and in spite of that, going off in an opposite direction. And therefore, calmness gives way to desperation as the prophets see one more temple destroyed. We've lost 2 already. One more settlement in the land of Israel destroyed. We were exiled twice from the land of Israel. If only we'd been exiled once It would be easier, but we've done it twice when we see individuals behaving self-destructively like this. We know what's going to happen. We observe their behavior. We can see the process of self-destruction from beginning to the end. If we care, we try to do something about it. If we don't care, we just sit on the sidelines and let them rot. Jeff.
When you take a look at all of the punishments which God has threatened to inflict upon the Jewish people, you can't help but make an identity between that and the parent who's driven so to distraction that he now is engaging in abuse of his child. This is not child abuse, this is people abuse. This is community abuse. This is as cruel to the entire collectivity of the Jewish people as a parent doing this more physically to an individual child. And not only that, it's providing a model of behavior for the Jewish people who are going to inherit this book. Because if this is what the model is that God is going to do to his people, then it's all right for a parent to whip a child into submissiveness, because the Bible provides a template.
Yeah, but you see, you again, in spite of my caution, you're all still talking about God. I've got nothing against God, but I prefer to put responsibility where responsibility lays. These texts were written by people. These texts were written by Hebrews, Israelites. These texts were written by our ancestors. We have to take responsibility for them. They were written by our great-grandparents to the nth degree. They saw something happening. Their anger, their passion, their rage. Marita. Well, now, Marita, you now have helped us considerably by drawing our attention to the fact that the issue is not putting on tefillin in the morning. The issue is really not eating kosher food. The issue is really not fasting on Yom Kippur. The issue is really not paying tithes. The issue is really not giving the kidneys and the liver and the fat and whatever you want to God and sprinkling blood all over the place and having meal offerings and guilt offerings. That's not the main issue. Behind all the ritual details is a value system. The value system is the Asherah value system, the pagan Canaanite value system against the Jewish value system. And the issue between those two value systems is very clear. I think you used the word iconic. One of them believes that God can be defined. One of them believes that God can be captured in form, either in sculptured form, in artistic form, or in verbal form. What the Torah and the Haftarah are suggesting is that there is no way to do to this new God what the Canaanites and the pagans do. That is to say, for reasons we can only fathom, at some point in the history of our ancestors, between the 13th and the 9th pre-Christian centuries, because of their experiences in Egypt, and Egypt was one of the greatest powers, it was the America of the ancient world. Egypt was the greatest power the world has ever seen. I mean, relatively speaking, to walk in Egypt, to work in Egypt, to know about Egyptian civilization and be a nomadic Hebrew slave, the gulf that separated the Hebraic slave, the nomad in Goshen, from this incredible architectural glory was vaster than some refugee from outer Mongolia coming to settle in New York. They were awed by it, and nevertheless they saw it as dust. They saw it as so much dust, and they were right. It takes time before Egypt turns into dust, but Jews think in very long term. Judaism is a long-term bond, a long-term bond. No short term here, no short term here. What was going on in the people because of that experience, that some of them sensed that freedom was not something that was, yes, it's okay, it's not okay. Freedom was something that was so important. Seeing through the immorality of a civilization like Egypt, which was based on slave labor, seeing through, not being taken in by the Lincoln Centers, by the museums, by the art, by the advertising firms, by the snobbery, by the yuppieism, by the elitism, by the thick use of words in all the media that we have today, by seeing through it all, the hollowness of it all, as compared to the man who lived in a cave in Central Park, in one of the parks, in the same city that Donald Trump lives in, seeing through all the froth of our so-called civilization to the heart of the matter, peace, love, people having food, having clothes, having a roof over their heads, that everybody should have these basic minimal rights, something which in our own society is not yet granted. To see through the garbage of the modern contemporary civilization, some of our ancestors went through that experience, and for a brief period of time, they were able to carry the majority of people with them for about 2 weeks. For about 2 weeks. And then the people wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back. And ever since then, Jewish experience has been one long agony of a dialectic between the handful that can see something of the ethical impetus behind the ritual, not seeing the ritual as an end in itself, but the ritual as a means of protecting the ethics, like a bank vault protects the valuable things that are inside it. So these people were excitable. These people were invested emotionally in this. And when they saw the people gradually slipping away, and they realized that if they slipped away, they would become destroyed, their calmness gave way to desperation. I don't like this reading, but I understand it. I can understand how spiritual leaders can become so disheartened at the phoniness and the hypocrisy surrounding them that they ultimately lose their cool and begin to curse out in the way in which the 27th chapter of Leviticus does. I don't like it. It's awful. It's awful to hear God saying, and God is only the voice of the people. God is only an expression of the people. I'll do this to you. I'll do that to you. He doesn't really want to do it to them, and that's what Jordan was saying. His saying all of this is his expression of desperation. When you see, I had a letter from a mother this week who wants me to go and talk to her son because she thinks her son has fallen onto evil ways. He's a big boy. I can't talk to him now. Neither can she. All of you parents out there, let me just give you a word of warning. After a certain age, the battle is all over. I'd say 6 or 7. So get in as much as you can before that, otherwise it's farfallen. Now, what are we going to do? I mean, I know this young man, and I know that what he's doing is very self-destructive. I know what's going on, but there's nothing I can do. I'm absolutely helpless. Because at that particular point in life that this young man is at, he only wants advice when he asks for it. And that's a very painful lesson that many parents and many teachers and many rabbis fail to learn. You can't intrude into people's lives. They want to destroy themselves, they have to. Sometimes you just have to look on, and it breaks my heart. This happens quite frequently. This is what these ancient authors are saying. They are saying we are helpless. The Jewish people are being seduced into assimilating into the surrounding culture. They are adopting their values. They have disregard for Jewish values. They don't realize that we aren't all pals together in this ethical business. There is a particular Jewish ethical edge which is not to be found elsewhere. This is our pride and glory. Without this, there is no purpose in being Jewish. There is no purpose in promoting Judaism. There's no purpose in advancing Judaism or trying to make Judaism grow or develop if there's not something intrinsically meritorious about the Jewish vision, something that other people can learn from also. How we deal with the issue of chosenness we've wrestled with this so frequently, I'm not going to raise that issue again this morning. But we must understand that the vulgarity of the anger of this God is an expression of the sense of desperation that the Jewish people feels. We always have to assimilate, we Jews, because we are always in a minority situation. Even in the Middle East, we are in a minority situation. We always have to assimilate. It's the law of nature. The minority always adapts to the majority. It has to in order to survive. But there are two kinds of assimilation. There is creative assimilation, and there is destructive assimilation. Creative assimilation is when you eat food that's good for you. It's absorbed in your body, helps you to grow. You take in the good and get rid of the bad. Destructive assimilation is when you take drugs, when you take things that are poisonous, when you take pesticides, when the food that you put in your mouth poisons you. That's destructive. It's corrosive. How do we distinguish between creative and destructive assimilation in any given era of Jewish life? Your guess is as good as mine, but not quite as good, because I've spent a lot more time worrying about this than you have. So I'm afraid I do have a little bit of an edge, just a tiny bit of an edge, but a little bit of an edge. And we're doing the same thing all over again. And what pains me is that people think that this text is an ancient text, and we should be reading something modern. You know, maybe the JTA Bulletin. If we really want to understand the crisis that the Jewish people is going through, all we need to do is to reflect, and I'm indebted to Nili, on the different meaning of Koma Miut. The meaning of Koma Miut used by Eliav and Eban, behind the flowery, sweet, beautiful words, there was a mailed fist. There was a bomb in that hand. Or Gandhi, or Martin Luther King. Now, I believe that had Gandhi tried to do what Gandhi did in Berlin in 1940, he would have had as much chance as a snowball in hell of doing anything about the political situation. And Billy is absolutely right. The Holocaust, on some fundamental level, changes all of our thinking about Jewish religion. I just hate to think, to quote Emil Fackenheim, that Hitler had a posthumous victory, that we can't think straight anymore about Jewish survival simply because one lunatic came along and destroyed 6 million Jews. That because of Hitler, we are going to literally destroy Judaism as it was, the Judaism which survived for 3,000 years, the Judaism which realized the limitations, the ultimate limitations of realpolitik. That we survived all these years, and that millions of Jews died al Kiddush Hashem in order that we might become power brokers like any other power broker. Now, I'm not dismissing the value of power. I know only too well the meaning of power. Without power, we are destroyed. But there has to be something between what even the most ethical leaders of the Jewish people are saying in public today and the needs of peacemaking in the land of Israel. We rise for our lane on page 194.